Hello, this is Kale. And for this week, as promised last week, we're going to be talking about the Polaris. Now, the Polaris has been one of the ships that I have heavily criticized and continue to criticize, despite also the recent changes that they want to make to it, whatever. Because to me it is a ship that doesn't make any sense at all. It is a ship where people try to cram everything into one ship that was never designed to do all of those things combined. And whenever you try to do that, you always end up with something that doesn't really do anything particularly well. Now, the Polaris' main two roles come down to being a torpedo slinger, and they say it is supposed to be a patrol ship for like fringe worlds which don't have a lot of budget. The problem here is that those are two roles that are kind of really different. And especially in the scenarios that we're going to be dealing with, because as a patrol ship you're probably going to be dealing with, some pirate activity, maybe I need to shoot down, deal with some fighters, maybe a carrack or something showing. Sorry, a carrack, a caterpillar or something showing up like that. That's the sort of targets that you're going to be dealing with as a patrol ship. Then I've got these massive sized 10 torpedoes which are clearly designed to engage capital units. The problem is if I'm going to be engaging capital units I want more than 10 torpedoes, because a lot of them will be getting shot down, I assume, by defenses. So I need to oversaturate those defenses, so I need to have a lot of them, which if I'm in a fringe system I don't really have, especially if I've got to be on a ship like this that is this gargantuan and that sacrifices a lot of space for a hangar bay. But I'm trying to attack capital ships, but that hangar bay is not going to do anything for me. So there's two main roles which are, honestly speaking, for the majority, rather mutually exclusive, as in how much of an effectiveness they're going to get out of it. So for this week's video, what I'm going to be looking at is how I would design this ship for either of those roles. So for the motor torpedo boat role, as I've described the ship for a long time, but also how I would design the ship as a patrol ship. So because two completely roles, two completely different sorts of design requirements that we're going to be having with. To start out with, let's go and speak about it from the motor torpedo boat role, which is the more relatively straightforward role, so it's the easiest one to get started with. As we know, as we talked about, we are of course talking here about our massive sized 10 torpedoes, which are being launched from either side of the ship, and either side launches too, so we have a total of 4 of those launched every single time, and we know that we have a storage capacity of 10 on board. Now of course 10 torpedoes with 4 launchers is kind of shit. I mean, it's actually really shit. And the main reason for that is you want to have volume of fire. Now, I understand that we may not be able to have like unlimited launchers out there, of course, because there's always going to be a limit to that. But there should be an ability to relatively swiftly reload those launchers, fire another volley, reload, fire another volley, and through that get that mass volume of fire to make sure that you have the best chance of actually successfully hitting a ship. Now if we take a look at the ship, I think we'll, which image shall we use? I think this one is actually best. The torpedoes are pretty much stored in this section here, is that front part of the ship. Then of course in the F part here we have engine clusters and all of that stuff, and then here in the middle, I mean, the majority of it is taken over by this giant hangar bay. If we want to be lobbing torpedoes, how would you redesign that? Like, what would you change to make it a better torpedo slinger? Well, first and foremost, of course, the hangar is going to be deleted. So we're going to be using this space here in the middle a lot more effectively. Now, beyond that, we have this very clear, like an arrow shape to our hull. Like, it's pretty much like this, and that means that perhaps we could have more torpedo launchers spread around on this hull, for example. I mean, maybe not 4 RSI, but probably something like 6 would definitely be helpful in getting an additional volume of fire. So that would give us at least, go from 2 on each side, we're going to go to 3 launchers on each side. Then this central area, which is now being taken over by our hangar, we're going to be using that to store torpedoes. Lots of torpedoes in our first design example. Now the bottom of let me put it this way, like the bottom of this will store torpedoes. The top part, so where we're looking at here, this hangar area, so this area here, so say roughly about this, is what we, instead of going to have a hangar there, like below there we're going to store torpedoes, but on top here I want to have a missile guidance system and also probably a sort of like maybe a control station or something for that. So what I mean by that is I want something that is there as a role as well of like, hey, we are lobbing these large torpedoes at them, but instead of them just doing their own thing, we are maintaining control over those torpedoes. Now, if you don't know, in current day submarines, if a torpedo gets fired from them, they are no longer dumb weapons. So like in World War II, you would pretty much see what you do here. Like you fire a weapon and it goes it will go in a straight line until it hits something. Or, later on they would have a homing system in the front. It would home until it hit something. The problem is there was no talking to the ship. So you could not communicate with your ship and the torpedo would do anything. And if that torpedo, say, instead of going this way, that torpedo went this way, you had a problem. Now, modern day torpedoes in submarines are actually connected by a wire to the main ship. This is just a really thin wire on a spool that goes all the way behind the torpedo, and through that wire you are communicating with that weapon, which allows you to change the search patterns, change if it goes active or passive, you can steer it, you can do a whole lot of things with that weapon. Now, of course, in a science fiction space, we do not need a cable, but we could still be talking with it. So instead of the cable, we have our wireless communication to the ship, and the ship is just speaking back to it, and we could be actually steering that weapon. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, if you look on top of here, that's a lot of space. That means we could have much more powerful sensor systems in there than would ever fit inside of that torpedo cone. Of course, that torpedo needs its own sensor systems, but if our sensors are much better, it probably means that we can steer the torpedo through defensive systems. Now, defensive systems are, of course, possible. Like a hard kill system is much harder to avoid. So if I got, say, this turret here and it was like shooting flak, the torpedo hits that, boom, okay, end of the game. But a lot of defensive systems are, of course, things like chaff or perhaps even jamming equipment, which would be tried to use to see that either the torpedo is like getting confused because it gets jammed and it doesn't see anything anymore, or it sees this big cloud of chaff which gives it a massive return. It's like, oh, there's my target, and then it just explodes harmlessly into a cloud of chaff. It doesn't have a sensor package that is capable enough probably to deal with these sorts of things. However, we can fit our sensor package right here. So that means with that sensor package and then communicating with our weapons, we can steer our weapons to the target. Now this does two things. Number one, it makes us stay on the battlefield, which is a really interesting thing, because if we're just lobbing torpedoes and I just got 10, I lob them and I'm running the hell away, which is not a very engaging gameplay as well. And secondly, because we're staying on the battlefield, we're talking gameplay, there is somebody in there who is doing this job. I'm not just dumb firing the missiles at somebody. No, I'm actually talking to those missiles, telling them it's like, hey, ignore this because I see on my sensor screen, I see a bunch of chaff showing up. It's like, yeah, ignore that. So just keep flying straight. And maybe the torpedo gets jammed and it comes back to me and it's just like, I don't know where I am. And you're just like, okay, just keep flying straight. You're doing fine. You can just look on your plot, you can see where your weapons are, you can see where the target is. So you can just hopefully guide it close enough to the target until it is so close that even the torpedo at some point is like, oh, I can see it again, or maybe even you manually guide that weapon into the target. This is not possible, of course, in fighter combat, but when you talk about these really large ships, they move much slower. This is definitely going to be possible. And that means that we have now created an entirely new gameplay loop around really large missiles, which actually makes torpedoes a much more unique sort of weapon to use versus the traditional missile that we see used a lot. And we are looking back, taking some stuff from World War II and of course some of our modern day technology, and we're applying that here to the game. So suddenly our ship is becoming a much more interesting candidate. It makes sense that we have our self-defense weapons because we are staying on the battlefield for an extended period of time, guiding in very potent warheads, which, because we are able to guide them in by the using of our own sensor systems, we can bypass certain amounts of defenses of the enemies, which also means, of course, that for the enemy we become a very high priority target. So you have a lot more of this thinking and going back and forth about it, because if I see a retaliator showing up, launching a bunch of torpedoes at me and buggering off again, I could probably be like, let's hope that my, flak and chaff deals with those things, because I've got other things to worry about. But if suddenly this Polaris shows up on the field, and it is getting a look at me, and it is firing its torpedoes, I know I'm in trouble. I need to get rid of that Polaris on the battlefield, because it can bypass most of my, soft passive defenses against those weapons, or even my jamming of those missiles. So there's a very high probability that if the Polaris is firing torpedoes at me, those torpedoes will connect. And when they connect, because they're size 10 torpedoes, they will do massive amounts of damage. So I would want to avoid that. So I need to reprioritize my engagement from, say, for example, fighting an enemy Idris or something else, to now I need to fight this Polaris because it actually forms a massive threat on the battlefield. And that creates a gameplay that becomes a lot more interesting on both a small scale, because hey, I've got somebody who's steering these torpedoes in, to a larger scale because hey, whenever a new ship enters the field, it completely changes the dynamics. While as in the current format, if a Retaliator or Polaris enters the field, either of those ships does exactly the same to the battlefield, because they both are going to lob torpedoes. The only difference is the Polaris is going to be lobbing those that are slightly larger, which is like, okay, they do more damage, but it's all sort of the same, and by the end of the day they're both gonna bugger off before I'm getting close to killing them anyway, so let's just hope the torpedoes don't hit and keep focusing what I'm doing. And it also means, finally, of course, that a single Polaris is going to be a lot more dangerous than a single Retaliator, or even a couple of Retaliators, because it can steer those weapons into the target. And that would make it a very interesting ship, and that would make it a full-on torpedo boat, and give it a level of gameplay in that combat role that is going to be both unique and highly interesting. So that is, of course, the motor torpedo boat. Relatively interesting, or relatively simple, but very interesting, I think. And I really think it would be a massive enhancement to the way combat would be played, because suddenly missiles become a completely different form of threat than they are currently. So let's go ahead and move on to the other role, of course, the patrol boat. So when it comes to a patrol boat, what you're looking at is a, probably like a Coast Guard cutter, or some places the Navy does this with smaller ships. Like for my own Navy, the Dutch Royal Navy, they have the Holland class offshore patrol ships, and these are, fairly decent ships, but while they're Navy ships, they're obviously not really naval combatants. Although the sensor systems on them make some people question what the hell we were planning to do with the damn things, but nobody is telling us, so who knows. But the simple fact is, their main job is more so we are going to be patrolling areas where we are dealing with certain specific types of threats, like for example drug smuggling. That's where a patrol ship comes into play. You're literally there to just patrol an area and deal with anything that is not an actual naval combatant. So, if we're going to be a patrol ship, the first thing we do is, of course, we're going to be deleting the torpedoes. Those things are utterly and completely ridiculously and useless to us. We are not fighting big, scary things. That's not our job. Our job is to be dealing with cutlasses, caterpillars, and other sorts of light stuff that decides to show up in our area of operations. Maybe even something like a hammerhead. So what would you do? Well, we could say we keep some torpedoes to deal, of course, with a hammerhead. The problem there is that the other idea behind this is like this is sold to fringe systems, they don't have a lot of budget. Missiles tend to be fairly expensive pieces of equipment, so lore-wise that story doesn't really add up. And again, because we're skipping from going after massive capital, so size 10 torpedoes, to dealing with something really no larger than a hammerhead, and even that should be an exception. What I want to do instead is say that with gun underneath here, we just get a single, double barrel, like larger gun. Like, think more akin to what a Perseus has, in that area of sort of operations. So perhaps a single chin-mounted Perseus style gun would do us excellent for our patrol ship. And beyond that, we probably want to have a few more of these turrets, because right now we are very vulnerable in our rear sections a bit. There's one here, but we could do with some better coverage, because right now, for example, here we have a bit of a dead zone. So, better turret placement around. We get a good, nice amount of coverage, and probably most of those would be remotely operated, because it allows us to quickly, switch around and also automate certain of these things, so we don't need the maximum amount of crew. Now, what will we do, of course, with this hangar area? Well, a hangar area somewhat makes sense, but it needs to be retold a little bit, because what I want to have is something that allows me to do the job of a patrol ship. So what I need is not a fighter-sized ship like we see here, of course, a Gladius. I'm not sure, well, yeah, here we see a Sabre leaving. That's not really what I need. What I need is a interceptor. So from here I want to have, for example, a M50. That would be great, something like an interceptor size ship. And I also want to have a Pisces. I think it's a C8 Pisces these days. Forgive my horrible language, but that's the sort of things that I would want. Like, so an Interceptor 2 and a Pisces shuttlecraft. That's what I need for my small craft, which means that this hangar bay can also be more shallow. So that means I get more space underneath to put in other stuffs. For example, a couple of holding cells. Because I'm a patrol ship, I may need to be busting some smugglers or some pirates that I'm actually capturing, so I need to have a place to hold them on board of my ship. Maybe I want to have some additional crew quarters, because we're going to be on patrol for, maybe some time, depending on your scenario. But it could also be that I actually make less crew quarter, or amenities, because I'm just like, hey, this ship is just going out for a day and then it comes back and it just rotates in and out like that. Depends entirely on your given scenario and ways of operations. And maybe even, we give it a nice ground hangar with some smaller stuff, so it can perform some humanitarian style missions. Because overall, patrol ships tend to be a very flexible sort of platform that does a lot of things. But what it most definitely does not is be in a main fleet combat engagement like this. A patrol ship's job is not to be here. Like, if the Vandals show up, the patrol ship's job is just to be like, UE Navy, your job, go, kill. I'm just going to be waiting back here, because, not my place. Not my place at all. And maybe it would still be joining him. Maybe it would join in as a flank escort. But really, it's a patrol ship. Even with a single Perseus gun under there, it would... it would be alright, I guess, in a fleet engagement, but it should never be its main job. Its main job is to be out there, be present, have the ability to intercept criminal activity, to apprehend criminal activity, to also perform inspections. So say somebody shows up, like a large cargo ship shows up, that shuttlecraft flies over, a couple of customs officers board the ship, check the logs, do some spot checks on the cargo, etc. That's the sort of role that a patrol ship needs to be performing. And I think it could do an excellent job at that. It needs very few changes. You remove the torpedoes, you probably use that space perhaps for probably rearrange it really for the main gun under there, because guns are cheaper to use than missiles, and we're trying to keep the cost as low as possible, even if we do need to shoot at things. We know we get ourselves 1 or 2 small interceptors and a small by-sea shuttlecraft, so relatively low height additions that give us the ability to intercept anybody who's trying to run away. So maybe there's going to be some sort of an interceptor that has like a quantum jammer on there, because the patrol ship itself is going to be relatively shallow, so their job is just going to be okay. Quantum jam, maybe some other means to slow down a target, and then the patrol ship can just move in and deal with it accordingly. That gives you a extraordinarily capable patrol ship, and I think also a lot more interesting of a ship to play around with, because you have a ship that is very much dedicated to doing the sort of role that you want it to do. So yeah, that is how I would design the Polaris when it comes to the requirements and the jobs that it would do for the main part of it. So I would really split it up. I want to have a torpedo boat that has a dedicated torpedo system in there, so that I can guide those weapons, have somebody actually at the controls of those things. That means it is a completely reworked engagement profile, and also changes the battlefield overall. And on the patrol ship, I really have this patrol ship. It is out there, it has some things to deal with, specifically criminal elements. It has a means to, if it really needs to, engage a slightly more dangerous opponent, but relatively speaking, that's not really its job. That main gun is mainly there if somebody shows up with a slightly larger ship and they're like, oh, maybe I can fight this, then you can just be like, yeah, but I've got big gun. You don't want to fight me with big gun. Something along those lines. Now, the final thing that I want to address is applicable a little bit to boat, and that is this bridge scenario at the nose of the ship. Can we please not? I mean, there is no good reason to put your bridge, your command center, at the absolute frontal portion of the ship, at the center of it, the one place that everybody's going to be aiming at when they're shooting at it when you're approaching. Please do not put your bridges there. I know that we want to have our exposed bridges and they look cool, but then put them like, somewhere higher up or down below or something, at least tucked away so that they're not in the literal center of where you're going to get shot off. I mean, I know it's a completely different thing, but this reminds me of my days when I was playing Overwatch. It's like with D.Va, it's just like, yeah, if you want to get critical hit shots on D.Va, you aim at the center of the mech and you get your crit shots. It's not really good design. Let's put it that way. So yeah, change the bridge location, probably just do something like the Perseus does, like move it a little bit up or something. You can even keep it flush with the hull, just move it in a little bit more. All these shots are mostly from there, so maybe, instead of having it all the way down here, maybe you move it somewhere around here and have just like a wider opening in there. It would look, I think, really interesting and still really cool, and it would just mean that your front can be slightly different profile and not immediately have your entire ship's control taken out with a single lucky hit that goes through your shield and then through your bridge window, which I think is a really bit of a bad idea in general. Anyhow, that is it completely. Please let me know what you think in the comments about this, splitting it up and really making it a proper torpedo boat or proper patrol boat. And if you really think that the Polaris Assistant is a excellent design, is absolutely amazing, I guess that's your opinion, and I'm going to say that my opinion is that your opinion is absolutely and utterly entirely wrong. Sorry, but not sorry. It is just not a good design. And that's why I came up with some reworks. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching, and I hope it has been at least informative, if not somewhat maybe a little bit entertaining, although I'm not sure how entertaining I am in these things, time will tell. But yeah, for me, I'll see you hopefully all next week. Bye bye.